Now, these Unitarian financial backers knew Brown was planning a revolt, but they weren't entirely comfortable with it. Howe said to him, "Don't tell me what you're about to do or where you're going." And Howe later publicly denied having known about the plot at all, even perjuring himself before the congressional committee that investigated the raid. However, the two other Unitarians, Theodore Parker and, what was his name? Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Not a name I had known before this. But these two other Unitarians stood firm, vigorously defending Brown's actions. And the Transcendentalists, famously part of our Unitarian heritage, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, were the people who strongly defended John Brown publicly in the wake of the raid. If it weren't for the Transcendentalists, biographer Reynolds argues, Brown would have been dismissed as a curious anomaly of history, an early sketch of someone like the Unabomber. But it was because of our Unitarian forebears that John Brown's action became so relevant. The first Brown biographer, he wrote a biography of Brown not long after the raid, dedicated his book to Ralph Waldo Emerson, a former Unitarian minister, as you may know, and his good friend Henry David Thoreau. This biographer said that these two, Emerson and Thoreau, were defenders of the faith who, when the mob shouted, "Madman," Thoreau and Emerson shouted, "Saint." On the night he learned of the raid on Harper's Ferry, Thoreau wrote in his journal, "When a government puts forth its strength on the side of injustice, as ours has today, to maintain slavery and to kill the liberators of the slave, what a merely brute and worse than brute force it is seen to be." When people argued that Brown won't gain anything by his actions, Thoreau's response was, "No doubt you can get more in your market for a quart of milk than for a quart of blood, but that's not the market that heroes carry their blood to." In our day, as Unitarian Universalists, I can't help but wonder, where do we carry our blood to? For what would we be willing to die? Is there anything for which we would be willing to die, and is there anything for which we would be willing to kill? Thoreau announced in Concord, Massachusetts, that on October 30th, just a week and a half after the raids, he was going to give a lecture in the town hall in support of John Brown. The county Republican Party, and remember, we associate now the Republican Party with the South, but at the time, the Republican Party was the party of the North and of the abolitionists. The county Republican Party and a Concord anti-slavery committee called Thoreau's idea of giving this speech, he called the idea impolitic and extreme. Thoreau replied, "I did not send to you to ask your advice, but simply to announce that I am to speak." When the time came and the town officials refused to ring the bell summoning the citizens to the lecture, Thoreau rang it himself. The talk he gave was called "A Plea for Captain John Brown." Just at the time when those truly intimate with Brown were trying to cover up their connection with him, Thoreau was going out of his way to suggest that Brown was his friend and confidant. Thoreau's actions roused to Brown's defense the intellectual leaders surrounding Thoreau, notably Ralph Waldo Emerson, who had huge cultural clout. And so Thoreau and his fellow Transcendentalists, most of them Unitarian, planted the seed that eventually grew into the North's veneration of John Brown. And that song, "John Brown's Body Lies a Mouldering in the Grave," was a rousing song that the Union troops used to bring themselves into battle and to encourage themselves. So these transcendentalists did their part to rid America of slavery by introducing a radically new idea. The idea that the leader of the raid on Harper's Ferry was not a lunatic, but a hero. So was Brown a man to admire or to vilify? He had caused the death of 11 people, and prior to that, in Kansas, he had led a group of people, including his own children, to murder 5 people in Kansas. A series of murders that he was never brought to justice for, because at that time in Kansas, no one was brought to justice for anything. His own son, who had participated in this murder of these pro-slavery activists, and in Kansas at that time, pro-slavery people were flooding into Kansas in order to very violently vote for, take over polling stations that they had no business being in, and vote in pro-slavery legislatures. It was a very, very violent place, and so Brown's murder of these 5 people has to be seen in that context. However, it resulted in the murder of one of his own children, and in another of his sons went, what they would say back in those days, went mad as a result of having participated in this killing. So was Brown a man to admire or to vilify? As I've made clear, some of our Unitarian forebears believed him worthy of praise. And it must be said that by supporting the raid on Harper's Ferry, these Unitarians and Transcendentalists, who we are justly proud of, were, of course, supporting terrorism. For no other word fits John Brown's intentions as well as does the word terrorism. And so as I have been reading about Brown, I've had to wrestle with the truth of that, I feel. It was the hope that such acts as this raid would strike terror in the South. That was the point of the raid, and that is the point of terrorism. The hope was that it would set them into panic and confusion and disarray, in the hope that that terror would cause the South to do what their consciences had not had the power to make them do. Thoreau's reaction to John Brown's actions were, I have to wrestle with this, not very different from the reaction that a Palestinian friend of mine had to the events of 9/11. And I've spoken of this friend in a previous sermon. She was a student at Manhattanville College when I worked there. She was one of the students I was closest to, a young person I loved dearly, and whose family story of suffering as Palestinians I knew very well. When I noticed on 9/11 that she seemed pleased with what was happening, it took me a while to ask her about her views. But because of our close relationship, she was willing to say to me that she saw the attack on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center as a blow against the strong on behalf of the weak. She felt that bringing down the power of the United States was inherently a good thing because of all the pain that U.S. policy had caused and was causing to her people and so many peoples around the world. Now, she did not see the United States as an inherently evil place, nor its people as evil people. But she did believe that the undue power of U.S. military and economic might was an evil, and that 9/11 was a blow against that evil. In other words, she saw 9/11 in much the same way that Thoreau and Emerson saw the raid on Harper's Ferry. It was not that there was nothing redeemable about Southern culture, and it was not that every slaveholder was inherently an evil human being, but the system itself was evil. And it was sad that anyone died in order to strike the system a mortal blow. But the real issue was not these deaths, the deaths of those 11 people caused by John Brown. It was the system itself. And so seeing these two acts of violence